The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
What a joy it is to have the guest that we do this week. I've been a fan of her and her writings now for years, and a particular joy to me was I actually got to meet her in person when we screened her feature documentary debut at Midwest Weird Fest earlier in March of this year.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually got to see the screening, which was again the world premiere, with an audience for the first time with the filmmaker. I'd already seen the film, but that was your first experience of it. So that must have been an incredible thrill, I would think.
Yes. Yeah. It was really, really good. And I thought it was really cool that she won Best Documentary at Midwest Weird Fest.
Oh, she did an incredible job, and she co-directed the film with her son, Nate, but she's been a veteran of the broader paranormal field for years. She's researched and written about a broad range of subjects from cryptids and hauntings and UFOs, and perhaps she's best known for her writings on werewolves and other upright canine creatures. Her most recent book, which is great, is called I Know What I Saw, Modern-Day Encounters with Monsters of New Urban Legend and Ancient Lore, and her directorial debut, which we screened at Midwest Weird Fest, is called Return to Wildcat Mountain, Wisconsin's Black Panther Nexus. So without any further ado, and with considerable joy, I'd love to introduce the one and only Linda S. Godfrey. I know, I've listened to so many shows of yours over the years, Linda. As you know, I'm such an incredibly massive fan. In fact, I think well, it's true. To be honest, there would be no Talking Weird without you. There was no Midwest Weird Fest, which is the festival I run in Eau Claire. That only came about really because I read Weird Wisconsin early on in my days of moving to this state. And it was that book that inspired me to start Midwest Weird Fest. And as a result, Talking Weird's in many ways an offshoot of that festival anyway. So you're almost like our patron saint that we're having on the show today.
Oh, not saintly at all. It was all accidental, what can you say? Well, I don't believe in true complete accidents, but I mean, it wasn't. People sometimes think that I had this big lifelong passion for werewolves and set out to find one. It wasn't like that at all. So
yeah,
it's such an amazing story how you were originally a writer and a journalist, and you almost bumped into the Bray Road story. And I think anybody with a passing interest in the paranormal knows that you're essentially maybe the only person I can think of in living memory who's coined the term of a majorly known cryptid now, it being the Beast of Bray Road, which is the term you coined and have written so much about. So I'm not going to ask you about the Beast of Bray Road, though, but what I am fascinated about is the wonderful film of yours that we screened at Midwest Weird Fest this year. It interests me how that was your first jumping off as a feature film, that you didn't do a Bray Road film. Instead, you did one on essentially, I guess, what would be called, is it alien big cats or alien black cats in the traditional Fortean type terminology, or Black Panthers or whatever we want to call them. So what drew you initially to making Return to Wildcat Mountain as your feature debut?
Well, I'd always been interested, in what they call the Black Mystery Cats or the Black Panthers, but it had always seemed to me over the years that the most and best literature was from the UK. They've had lots of incidents going way back into the 1500s, and they had, I think in their heyday, they were just as, if not more, I'm going to say popular, but not popular in a good way, among fine people of England and pretty much the whole medieval world. So I hadn't paid a lot of attention to them. I had to do some research, though, for Weird Michigan. And Weird Michigan had quite a black cat flap going on for some years. And so I was kind of intrigued by that. But I still didn't really, not being known for it, I would get an occasional letter from people on it, but I didn't get as many as I did for upright canines or Bigfoot even. So what happened was about, 5 or 6 years ago, there was a man who was a former newspaper editor and also just a freelance writer for the paper in Hillsboro, Wisconsin, which is a very small town, just about smack dab in the center of the state. And it's really special for several reasons. One is that it has this incredible, weird geology that, for one thing, it was avoided by the last glacier that came through. The glacier sort of split apart when it got to that area and went around it, which means that you're driving through Wisconsin and you've got all these nice farm fields, rolling land, and then you come to this place that looks like wild Montana or Colorado. There are cliffs, there are rivers, deep, deep valleys. It's so gorgeous that it's just amazing. And people don't even realize it's there, but I knew it was there because one of my grandmothers lived in Hillsboro, and my other grandmother lived about 15 miles away. So I had received a tip-off from this man in Hillsboro, lifelong resident, Steve Stanek, who had a couple of weird things to tell me that he just wanted to submit. He didn't know what to do with them. And one was called the Hillsboro, well, some people called it the Hillsboro Monster. It turned out that it was just a mundane animal that really wasn't very big at all. It was hairless, so people thought it was, some type of chupacabra. They were calling it that. And I noticed his name was Stephen Stanek, and I wrote back and I said, well, I don't think this is anything, that the creature is anything too much, but you must be checked because, I just know that Stanek name. It sounds like an old-time Hillsboro name. And he was astonished and wrote back and sent me some newspaper clips. And these newspaper clips were not like, normally if you get a sort of, if the paper will condescend to write something about it, there is usually just like one little creature, it's a couple inches. He had taken up like several pages of prime newspaper space, and one of them he had like 40 different sightings, and they were all around, I'd say within an 18-mile radius of Hillsboro, with Hillsboro in the center. He had been going out and getting stories from these people, and just because he was so interested in them, and I realized that it was just an unbelievable number of sightings for this area. And he had, I think he had counted them somewhere well over 150 sightings just in this little area in the previous decade or two. And he said it was probably more than that. And the interesting thing was that over half of the sightings were what looked like black jaguars or mountain lions. And there can be black jaguars, but there's no reason they should be in Hillsboro, Wisconsin. And there could be black leopards. They're also usually down south, but black mountain lions are not supposed to exist. Genetically impossible, say the zoologists. And he found this really interesting too. And so he started sending me whenever he had new things on it, and I had a file that I was filling up. And it was about, the last few years had turned into this film area where people were finally really getting interested in making films about all of these different creatures, and I'm sure you are familiar with Seth Breedlove. He was one of the people enrolled in the last.
No, you're right. We screened his on the Trail of UFOs at the same festival. We screened your wonderful Return to Wildcat Mountain. In fact, you appear quite obviously significantly in his Beast of Bray Road documentary, if I recall.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I think he told me he had never done a film with one witness that was relied upon so much. But that film is a little different. I'm not just any witness. I was the one that was there and, met the original ones and talked the paper into printing it and all that kind of thing. So I had a little more to do with it than usual. But I had talked to Seth. It occurred to me that the black mystery cats should be a really terrific subject for filming. And I had probably four, the same last year and a half or so as when Seth filmed me. I had 3 or 4 other of the big TV studio backed ones. Well, Seth's is a little different. He had a Kickstarter, but there were several from Travel Channel and History Channel and a couple others. And I was asking all of them, hey, wouldn't you want to do a story on this? Because I just wanted to see the story come out and see the incredible encounters that these people have been having. And everybody said, well, we'd love to, but, we're booked up right now. We can't do it. And it occurred to me after asking a few people about it, and it wasn't that they were dismissing the subject. They just really were truly very busy. And I said, well, I guess I could do it because, and this is where, I don't know if you're in for some a strange string of quote unquote coincidences.
Absolutely.
But I think I told that story a little bit at the conference. But my uncle, he was a great uncle, but he wasn't a great uncle. I think of him in those terms because he's connected with a whole bunch of people who are great uncles. But my uncle, Laverne Blado was his name, sadly had passed away not too long before I had that thought. And he had left a little bit of money to me and my 6 younger brothers and sisters. So when you divide any inheritance up by 7, it's not going to be huge. But I realized that I had enough that I could hire. Here's the second coincidence. My youngest son, I have 2 sons, and the youngest one has a degree in film from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And that was his specialty. And he was kind of between other things, and but nothing too pressing. And I knew I could nab him away to Hillsborough on weekends, and he could make the movie. And he was very happy to do that. And I wanted to work with someone who would have sort of the same vision for it as I did. And it's certainly not that Nate and I agree on everything, but miraculously he did. He really got the idea of how I wanted it. Then there was also telling my husband, who, had some ideas that we might use my little inheritance for, and it's like, well, fix the deck or make a movie, fix the deck. And I had a feeling I knew which one he was going to want to do. And he said, I told him, and he said, let's make a movie, which, he has really no prior background in anything like that. So that, in fact, he used the term, the stars were aligned. So it was just kind of like everybody I needed to do this was connecting. And we were able to hire Steve Stanek as a field producer because he had the connections to all these people. And I actually had a literal vision that was sort of a portent, I think, of how this would go. And I've had these off and on during my life, even when I was too little to know what they were. And every once in a while, something like this happens and I pay attention. But in my vision, I saw an small empty box being handed to me, and the message was something like, don't worry that the box looks empty now. It's going to fill up of its own accord and you'll have what you need. And really that has been borne out. So we made it, and my son really did more than I expected. So we were really happy with it. But it is such an amazing mystery as to how all of these large cats that should not belong in that geographical location are there, and how the people see them, and how it's denied by wildlife officials. And also, it's interesting to think that all of them have been seen just about in daylight. Many times there were Amish people out plowing their fields. They didn't have guns with them. And it's pretty amazing there have been not even anything close to a fatality or an attack on a human, although they seem to have a real taste for young bull cattle. Several of them have been found. And so it just it came together. We kept working at it. We're still, and I mean, really, literally, I did not know what I was doing filmmaking. And I've quickly learned that it's a lot different to have somebody sit you down and tell your story than it is to make the story. And I'm sure you know what I mean by that. Anybody who's made a film, it was a lot harder than we thought. And I mean, I literally went on Amazon and found the 3 newest editions of filmmaking books and ordered them and gave one to Steve, one to Nate, and one to me. And then we circled them around and just kind of audaciously started.
I think you and Nate just did an incredible job as well. It's such a solid documentary.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, we wanted it to show, not just to show the beauty of the land and la la la, here's these beautiful cats, although they are. We wanted it to show what the people were thinking and saying. And so right away, I was like, I'm not going to be in this movie. It's not about me. It's about all the eyewitnesses. And we wanted to really give them a chance to just speak their hearts, their minds, without any, we had no sort of script for them at all. And I know a couple of places people asked me if we hired actors because they did such a good job. And no, absolutely not. They're all real as rain, as my grandma used to say. So that was another really important part, was we wanted them to tell their piece. And then we had we felt really lucky to have found the wonderful guy who runs the Great Cat Shelter just west of Baraboo, Wisconsin, who was really lent a lot of technical expertise about, I mean, he knows these big cats and was able to give a lot of information that people might not find elsewhere about them. And then we had the gentleman who was also a former Hillsborough newspaper editor, Paul Arntz, who was, he gave us a really cool and, again, just from the heart story of the Native American view of these animals. So we put all those elements together. Oh yeah, we even had Little House in the Prairie. Actually, it was Little House. Yeah, because who knew that Laura Ingalls Wilder's grandfather was attacked riding home from Pepin to the cabin in the big woods?
Yeah.
So.
And by a Black Panther as well, is
right.
The narrative
Yes,
says, right?
Exactly. That was the main point of why we wanted it in there, because we wanted to show there were large black cats going back 2 centuries, if you were in the right place. So that was kind of how it came together.
There's so much we could dissect about what you just said. It's such a fascinating story. But to stay on the Laura Ingalls issue, this is something I hadn't even thought about until we brought it up again now. I know it's in the documentary, but the fact that happened so long ago kind of almost dismisses, in a way, one of the more popular theories about how these Black Panthers got there. Because I know I'm from Australia, and I'm also aware there's similar sightings both in my country, which I'm in the United States is my country now, but the country I grew up in, and also in the United Kingdom and other places, of these large black cats, which are always out of place geographically where they are. The most common practical theory is the theories you're well aware of, that somebody must have had, a pet jaguar or something, and it got out into the wild. And I know that's one of the, perhaps the most practical interpretations to go to when we look at this. But if there was something terrorizing Laura Ingalls' grandfather, it seems highly unlikely that there was a black jaguar released into the American wilds before that. People weren't owning, big cat farms or keeping them as pets, as far as I would think, back in the 18th century or something.
No, and there were jaguars and leopards that went farther north, that lived farther north than they do now. Especially the jaguars were all up. If you look on a map of their existence, it's surprising and shocking. And of course, the mountain lions had a really wide range all over the United States too, but they got pushed back when the settlers came and wanted the land and cleared it. And the thing is, though, there have been incidents where these big cats were in circuses and escaped. I found one in Walworth County history logs. There was a circus owner. His name was Don. They called him Doc Popcorn Hall because he was the first one to serve popcorn at a circus. And they overwintered just about, it was out southeastern Wisconsin, right outside the town of Evansville. And they had a leopard that escaped its cage and got away. It leaped up into a tree. The whole town turned out to form a posse to go and get it, this one cat. And some of them just had like pitchforks, there were a few had guns. And they finally shot at the cat. It jumped down, and on its way to the ground, it just latched onto one of the farmers and injured him rather severely, and could ostensibly have gotten away, but this is one where there were enough people to take him down. So it's not that doesn't happen. It can. And, like the property owner in the documentary says, all we have separating us and them as free-running big cats are these cages we build, and the cages are subject to human error. If you don't open the cage just right, they get out, and then they're gone. And there are people who own big cats and things. In fact, I have pictures of my actual great uncle and his son. They owned a bobcat, which is quite a bit smaller than a mountain lion. It's a little easier, but they can still they can bring down something twice their size, and they can get to be up to 30, 36 pounds. So they could bring down a 60-pound dog or a kid or whatever. So they are all around too, but nothing really looks or moves like the mountain lion. And something really weird happened to me last week, which I don't mean to break up your story.
I'd love to hear.
Yeah.
Well, I still can't believe it when I say this. I saw in daylight from a relatively close position a smallish mountain lion eating a house cat.
Oh, wow.
And I wasn't out on it. I wasn't out like in the park or the state park or anything like that. I was just for a little walk. The city of Janesville, I live in Janesville. The city of Janesville is surrounded all the way around it. It's kind of like the Rock River comes in at the northern end and kind of oozes around the outer edges and then joins again. And just, I think, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, there was a tan cat that was spotted by several people down at the lower end of the bulge. And I live kind of at the top end of the bulge, and our house backs up to a nature conservancy walk. So there are all kinds of trees and things back there, and marshes. At the bottom of it is all marsh. And I was just out for a walk, and I saw something. There's a place where there's a bridge over two culverts, and you can go stand on either side of the road and look down into this marsh. And I was walking along, and I started hearing a house cat screaming. And it was light out. It wasn't dark or anything like that, but I could hear this house cat screaming. And the farther I went, I was thinking, one of the neighbors' dogs, somebody's cat, it sounded like a fight. The closer I got, the more incredibly loud it became. And there's nothing it could have been but a house cat with a typical meow screaming type of thing. If you've ever heard her, only it was much more intense than I'd ever heard. And I looked down, and there's what had to have been a mountain lion. It was not a black one. It was a buff one. And it wasn't huge. I think it may have been a female. And it had something, and it was, did you ever see your dog get a bone or something, and it puts one paw on the bone and then grabs with its teeth, and kind of the head comes back, he's trying to pick it apart. That's what this thing was doing. And every time the head went down, the cat would scream louder. The house cat. It was horrible. It was horrible. And I was trying to take a film of it, not a movie, but a video. And I had my camera out, and I was watching this thing for like 2 or 3 minutes. And it was a little bit breezy. I had a real trouble. I did get one where you can hear the cat plainly screaming. But the big cat's fur was so perfectly blended with the color of the marsh grass that I couldn't get one where you could actively see the creature, because it was, but I saw it not only pulling up strips of whatever off of this cat, but also when it became aware that I was there, it turned around, it looked at me, and then it disappeared. And I'm pretty sure it took the house cat with it. And then it came back and kicked with its hind legs. And I saw that really clearly until it had covered probably, I think it probably defecated there and covered that up. And I think that it carried the house cat into one of those culverts to get it out of the place. But I went back with my very patient husband, and and we walked down there, and there were prints that looked like large cat prints, mountain lion sized prints, and quite a bit of scat. And they have a very unusual formation of scat that if once you know what mountain lion scat looks like, you can't unsee it, you know. And so that was because my husband was he's the perfect skeptic, you know. He always makes me test out my theories. And even though he has been stalked by one himself, you know, he wanted to see all this for himself. But I just thought, this is so weird. And this is only like 2 weeks ago. I'm thinking, how is it that I got to see this? I think maybe it's because I'm always looking for things that are moving and out of place.
Yes.
Maybe it has something to do with it, but it also seemed prophetic in some way. I'm kind of shuddering to think of what.
It's certainly a synchronicity,
Yeah.
given the film that you just released.
Right, exactly, exactly. The only better thing would have been if it were black.
Right, yeah.
That would have been great, but, you know, you take what you can get, right?
I think some of these synchronicities and higher strangeness surrounding big cat sightings in Return to Wildcat Mountain, because of the veracity of the rural type witnesses, I think it very much sets the phenomenon like it's likely to be a real, a genuine physical black cat. But in your companion book, I Know What I Saw, which I absolutely adored as well, by the way, Linda, but that didn't surprise me. So all of your writing, I do. You give a few different possible explanations. And my favorite in that book is when you talk about the Pukwudgies, I think is how you pronounce it, these diminutive little people that are believed in by some Native Americans here. And one of the things about the Pukwudgies, which I guess are gnome-type creatures, you can probably describe them better than I can, is that the legend has them turning into cougars and into other dangerous animals. And you make a point in I Know What I Saw that it might coincide with perhaps some of the John Keel type theories that you mentioned in the book, that maybe all of these things are, I think the term you use, which to me really hit home, was that they all might be cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
And that was something that John Keel arrived at after many years of studying things over in the East Coast, was that the first hint is that when you find one place that seems to be a source of these weird animals, there are usually more, and they aren't always the same species. And that really stopped me. I remember when I read that, it kind of stopped me in my tracks and made me look at it from a different way, because there are also very many Native American, I don't want to call them legends because they're more than that to the tribal people, but culture stories is one way of saying it, that this transformative angle is just very central to everything they believe. And if something is existing in one form and needs to be something else, it just transforms into it. But there is also that, and that usually is believed to be something that starts out as a spirit and then can turn into other things. Now, I've had this told to me, and Paul Dittman, who's one of the witnesses, also brought this up, that he's been told, he's a former state patrolman, and sheriff's deputy, excuse me, and he's had a chance to talk to a great many of tribal people and ask them about these creatures. And they generally would say, well, if you see the buff-colored ones, the tan ones, they are usually just, and I hate to use the term just because they're more than just anything, but they are generally flesh and blood animals. But if you see the black ones, they could be, first of all, the black-furred cryptids, and that they can switch into other modes if they want. And I've actually witnessed a Native American woman who did some sort of a transformative thing
Oh.
and manifested an animal face over her face.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I witnessed a couple of different things. There's a book written about Agnes Whistling Elk, who was a shaman, and she took a woman who was a writer in as sort of a trainee, or she allowed her to really have some of the secrets that weren't known to most people. And she said they were talking on that topic, and as she watched Agnes speak about it, she saw 2 or 3 different animal faces come over Agnes, as if it were not like they were something separate, but as if they were integrated into her body. And she was just like too shocked to say anything about it. And then later, when she got up her nerve, after Agnes Whistling Elk came out of whatever, and she wasn't being threatening or anything like that, but she said, "How did you make those different looks?" And Agnes said, "Well, it depended upon what I wanted to project." And that's another key thing, because you have all of these animals that transform into different types of animals, or from human to creature, from creature back to human. And you're thinking, boy, there's a lot of processing going on there. But if you understand it as one giant matrix, perhaps that can work with the quantum computer that is the human brain, according to science. Projections can be made from the human mind.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying I have the solution and it's definitely this, but it gives you a lot to chew on when you realize that there are so many things all around the world, going back to the beginnings of civilization as we know it, where these things are transforming back and forth, and they can be one thing, they can be another, and size doesn't always matter. It can be a butterfly that turns into something full blown. So something like a large mountain lion, for instance.
Yeah.
And I always like to say it's definite that I'm not a scientist. I'm just giving my best layman thoughts on it and speculations.
I know Jen, funnily enough, before we came on, was talking to me before this interview about some questions she had for you regarding that type of transformation. So there's synchronicity there. So I think I'm going to stop hogging the questions and let Jen ask her question.
Sure.
She pretty much answered it. I mean, I was just wanting to know her thoughts on human metamorphosing, quantum entanglement. But I think she pretty much talked about that a little bit.
Yeah. And I mean, once you really get into talking about that subject, there's so many possibilities. You can go on and on. But then the thing that really adds to it is I really like to look at the whatever the surrounding habitat is, anything that's unusual. For instance, just outside of Hillsborough is the Baraboo Ridge, which is, I think, like 20 miles of low hills that are mostly made of this special rosy quartzite. Well, quartzite is, that's what we use in the old style radios. Quartz carries electricity, electromagnetic fields, and there's just this utterly huge pile of it right outside this little area. Can that have something to do with all these creatures that are showing up there? One of the most unique UFO sightings, and an early one too, occurred right over Hillsborough. And they were described by 2 different witnesses who were unaware at the same time of these 2 objects floating in the sky. They were parallel, and I think they talked about this a little bit at the conference. They were parallel, shaped like fence posts, according to the men, and they moved in tandem, in perfect tandem. And so they flew over Hillsborough, which had no flight paths at the time, no known flight paths. And the farmer looked up and saw it, and also his young son, the 2 of them, and they watched in amazement as it went right over their heads silently. And it was they were vertical when they first saw them, and then in tandem they moved horizontal and went straight for Wildcat Mountain, which is a known habitat, and that's its actual name that it's had since settlement days. which tells you something too. So, and there was also a string of unexplained plane crashes.
That fascinated me in the book when I read that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all there. There are just these places on Earth that where things come and go. And I don't think anybody has adequately explained them. Maybe some people have, and in my case, I just, missing the connection, or I don't want to believe that, so I won't. And that's something else that's always holding up any of us who want to investigate. We're kind of driven by what we want to see, what we think we saw, what we could believe we would see, and what we couldn't. We have a lot of human baggage in our brains.
Yes.
Yeah, I think if there's a phenomenon there, whatever it is, if it's somehow, as you were mentioning, those quartz formations in the Baraboo Range, which is another part I absolutely adored in I Know What I Saw, and the fact that maybe there's electromagnetic characteristics or something which somehow might interact with us. And I know again, this is something that John Keel, it always comes back to Keel with me, but I know that Keel talked about window areas, which certainly seems to be the case with that whole area around Hillsborough, and that they were often places which had these unique electromagnetic characteristics.
Right, yeah. There's a place out by Bray Road that has come to be known for a long time. The gentleman who owns it wanted to keep it private, but he had contacted me through some neighbors, and I assisted him doing a lot of experiments on this area in his 40 acres about that he had of a wheat field or hay field. And he was finding mutilated animals. And as long as the laws of Wisconsin and Illinois held that he could bring a deer carcass from his home in Illinois to Wisconsin and just leave it there for whatever creatures wanted to devour it, as long as that was legal. And he did that probably for a period of 5 years or so. But I don't know if you've read it, because I don't think it's in this book. I think it's in my last book before that. But I actually was able to witness a light globe, a basketball-sized light globe, with two very well-trained investigators on that same farm that came from the area where he always kept the carcasses. And we watched it come straight across the field toward the car where we had decided to do a night stakeout. And I was in the back seat so I could watch. I'm always kind of, I don't know, things that come up behind you, I think, are always scary. So I like to be in the back seat where I can watch that. And these two guys, both like 6'2", were in the front. So they kind of blocked out. So I've been blaming them ever since for my lack of a photograph, because I couldn't get around to take a picture. But this thing came straight across the field. It wasn't, lackadaisical in its jumping around or anything like you would expect an animal to do. Or people talk about electromagnetic will-o'-the-wisps that dodge here and there. This one was coming straight for us. It stopped 25 or so feet from the car and about the same amount in the air, so we had a really clear view of it. I could see between the two guys. We were all looking at it and going, what? Using various language exclamations. And because there was no way to identify it as anything, we could see it really well. It was lighted, but it wasn't lighting. It was self-lit sphere. And it stopped, and it was just sort of hovering like it was trying to figure out what we were doing. And my friend and co-worker Sanjay Singhal, who's an architect from Chicago, just instinctively grabbed this big flashlight and shone it on the light. And before we could really and I was just getting my camera in position, of course, and so I didn't get anything. But when he did that, it sort of just shivered, as we've all been trying to figure out the right word for it, and then sort of popped into itself. And then it was just gone. And we, all three of us, saw the whole thing together and saw the exact same thing. And yeah, it was just very, very weird. And then after it was gone, we're like, where did it go? And Sanjay jumped out of the car, went around. He said, I got to see if there's something behind those bushes. We were parked next to some brush. And he came back in about 2 minutes saying, I'm really sick. We have to leave right now.
Oh.
So it affected him, and a lot
Yeah.
of people say, well, it was probably the electromagnetic radiation from this thing because it had to have some sort of energy source, even just to be visible to our 3 sets of eyes. It had to have that at the very least. And the trouble with, and everybody says, oh, that's cool. That's really neat. But, it is and it isn't, because we don't know what these things are. We really don't. We don't know the effects that they could have on us. It's anecdotal from what I've seen happen to people, in some of these situations. But for Sanjay to feel ill, completely ill, and have to the point where we had to just rev out of there, it's just a very unusual thing.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I've actually had a few experiences with lights as well. What color was it like an orb or?
Well, it was a perfect sphere as far as I could see, and it was like a soft white, but not really white. It's hard to describe. It was silvery whitish.
Okay.
I guess you would say.
Okay. I live in Missouri, and several years back, I had witnessed 2 lights heading towards my direction. And at first I thought it was a car that was like coming down the driveway. But instead of it coming down the driveway, it started coming towards my house. But it was coming in an odd direction to where there was just no way it was a car. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out what it was because it was just floating in midair. And it eventually went towards the woods, and then it was gone. And then another time, I was asleep, and I was waiting for my ex-husband to come home. And I saw this orange light come through the house, but I thought maybe it was his headlights. So I waited for a little bit, and I thought, well, why didn't he come in? So I go out check. Maybe he wasn't even there. So I literally saw it in the house. And then finally, he actually got to experience one with me, and we had come home from town. It was probably about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And just as we parked above the tree line, we saw these 3 lights. And I think it was probably like red, green, and blue. And we just stared at it because we're trying to figure out what it was, because I live near an Air Force base. So we're automatically thinking it's, some different aircraft. But anyways, they started to dance around each other. So then we were like, okay, wait a minute, what is this?
That's wild.
Yeah, so we watched it for a little bit, and they danced around each other, and then they joined as one, or at least from where we were sitting, looked like they were as one. And then they just went out from each other. So one went up and the other 2 went the other direction, and then they were gone.
Wow.
So anything that has anything to do with about lights is quite interesting to me.
Didn't you say also, Jen, you'd had the sound of a big cat making a noise once or something?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I did. We've had a lot of weird experiences out at this farm. So I've got lots of stories. We did have some weird, crazy sounds for a little while, and it sounded like a woman screaming. And I know my ex-husband, he was scared to death because he was like, did you just hear that? And I'm like, no, I didn't. I was further back in the house. And so he would tell me about it, and I never experienced it. And finally I experienced it, and it really did sound like a woman screaming. And
Uncle Wilder's grandfather said it sounded like.
It was the most horrible sound, and it went on for a while, and we're like, what the heck? It scared us. But actually several years before that, when I was heading home from work, actually before I got to the farm, something went across the highway. And so I slow down because I think it's a deer, but it wasn't, because it had this long, thick tail. And so the more I looked at it, I'm like, oh, is that a mountain lion? So I really freaked out because I had kids, and I'm like, there's no way we have a mountain lion here. But maybe those 2 go together. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be. Wow. Yeah. And I've been getting more reports from people. I found out that Janesville, the town I was talking about where I'm living now, I've had 2 black mountain lion or panthers or whatever you want to call them sightings right on the outskirts of Janesville. So there have been 2 black ones and at least 2 tan ones, and they're not supposed to be there at all. So,
Yeah.
It's just, and there was one, I don't know if anybody knows much of Wisconsin geography, but there's a town called Burlington, again, the southeastern corner of the state. And I go there for some of my doctors, and I was there last fall just having my blood drawn. And the phlebotomist, the woman who takes the blood, she's got it like half in my arm, and she'd been kind of quizzing me as to what I did. I'm like, well, I'm an author. Oh, what do you write about? Oh, I write about strange animals. Oh, what kind of strange animals? And I said, well, right now I'm working on a movie about cougars coming back to Wisconsin. And it was a good thing she was done with that, because she yanked that thing out of my arm and said, I've seen one of those.
Oh.
And
wow.
Yeah, and she had been driving, I think hers was not at night either. It was daytime. Her shift was done like 5 o'clock, and she was driving home, and she went past a hayfield, and there was a black colored cougar crossing the road right in front of her, like it didn't care. And she said it went into the hayfield, and she said she could see where it was coming out of the hayfield. And the worst thing was that it was headed straight for a farm with a farmhouse, and she knew there were children in that farmhouse. And she thought, oh, I've got to stop and tell them. And she said she couldn't bring herself to do it, because she knew she would just be made fun of. Again, it's just southeastern Wisconsin. And it isn't just that Wisconsin is so special. Michigan has a ton of these same sightings. It's almost more, to me, I wanted it to be an example, the film, of what these communities all go through. They all have the same types of sightings, the same sorts of encounters, and the same rejections from local officials and their families and friends.
Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely a problem, I think, for anybody who comes forward with a report of an out-of-place animal or a UFO or a Bigfoot. And I know what I saw, your final chapter in that book is about the fact that you yourself have seen Bigfoot. And you're also telling both myself and Jen at Midwest Weird Fest some of your experiences. I'd love for you to be able to tell us some more now, or some for the listeners to hear.
Well, yeah. And again, but these things, it's something like, I always thought it would be so cool. And it was something that I was always on the alert for. But when it happens and it's real, and you're subject to its whims because of your location and where it is, it really is terrifying. And, I think can change people in subtle ways that they don't even realize. Not just, because you're frightened, but because, as many people say, I saw something that isn't supposed to be there, and now I know it is, and what am I going to do with that? But yeah, I don't know. Was there one in particular that I mentioned that you'd want me to tell about? Because there have been several. I saw 3 in 1 year.
I think I remember you talking about your grandmother and how she experienced it too. So I thought it was really neat that it was something that your family experiences, like it's passed down through family to be able to see it.
It wasn't my grandmother.
Okay.
But I probably had something that sounded like that. And I did bring up my grandmother's, because they both
you did.
Other weird things going on. But my grandson, who was 7 at the time, maybe that was
that was a fascinating story. I'd love to hear that again.
Yeah, and he, as I said, he was only 7 years old. We were still living out by the Lauderdale Lakes, which is right on the very bottom end of the Kettle Moraine State Park, which I started having Bigfoot reported to me from there way back in 1991, 92, as soon as the Bray Road story hit, because people were seeing not just an upright canine, but what they recognized as Bigfoot. And we lived there about 20 years before I started really having any sightings of one. And I had, my grandson is this tender little guy, 7 years old. I didn't make any big deal of it in front of him. I didn't want to scare him or anything like that. So he knew, he saw my books and he kind of knew about it, but he never seemed too terribly interested. Well, he and I were returning from someplace. My husband was gone. We were the only ones in the house. And we walked in. The dog, for some reason, didn't come up to bark at us, but was hiding under the sofa, which I thought was strange. And I turned to hang up our jackets that we had on, and my grandson went and looked out our picture window that's in the living room, which looks out over the acre of yard that's surrounded on a couple of sides by these deep kettles. Again, it was thanks to the last Ice Age glacier. And anyway, he didn't say anything, but I heard him go, like that. And he was not an excitable kid. He still isn't. He's very laid back, very kind of cool acting kid. He's not one for jokes or anything like that. And he came walking as fast as he could to me, and he said, "Grandma, I think I just saw a Bigfoot."
Mm.
And I'm like, "Really?" And he said, "Yes." And he took me over he said it ran right in front of the window, and I had him demonstrate for me how it looked when it walked. And he said, I couldn't see the face, because it had like hairs over its face or something like that.
Yeah.
And he said it was going so fast, the head was kind of a blur, was the way he put it. And then he did the exact correct arm, kind of bent over a little, and the arms down by the knees, and performed the walk for me. And I was just and then the whole evening, he would not get more than 3 feet away from me. He even made me stand outside the bathroom door when he went in to use the bathroom. And so I've always, and every once in a while, he'll bring it up, not often, but he'll say, "Grandma, what was the real reason you moved from that house?"
Oh.
and he's dead serious,
Yeah.
He wants to know, but he doesn't want to know. But I went out and I did find footprints that were, the thing about glacial soil is it's full of little pebbles and stones, and almost gravel-like, and it's very hard to get a deep impression. But it was enough that I could see the feet, and they would have come from the woods on the right side of our yard, and I could see exactly what it was trying to do. It was trying to get from the kettle on our side of the yard to some pine trees where it could go down the neighbor's slope.
Oh.
And so, it all made perfect sense. And I had already had an incident there too, but I did also have 3 sightings of what I believe was the same Bigfoot creature. And I think it seemed to me like it was a juvenile, because it seemed a little bit smaller than the adult. But I've often thought, why did it let me see it 3 times in a year? And each time it was doing something different, and it was framed against some background where it clearly stood out. And that's something I still think about. And I don't know how much time you have. It would take me a while to tell each of the positions, but the sightings were within probably about a mile of one another, in sort of adjacent fields that had different things growing in them. And they all occurred when I was doing something else, just walking, and I didn't even have my phone with me at the time, my phone or the camera. So, it's something that you ponder. I do think I know. I have a theory. I don't know if you're interested in that.
Absolutely,
Yes.
I am.
Well, it was about that time that I had cancer. I had breast cancer, and I had quite a good regimen, and I had the full throttle surgery, followed by the chemo, followed by the radiation. Then I had more chemo. I didn't have hair for a while, and my doctor had told me that my prognosis wasn't very good. And actually, that happened as early as 2007, so it was a while after that. But when I was recovering from that, I had this nice big neighborhood I could walk around in. Most of the houses, or at least half of them, were weekend people, so there weren't many people around during the weekend. And I would just walk those roads and paths, and with my little kerchief on, and I would sing. I was a music minor in college, and so I have a little repertoire, and just some plain old hymnal songs. Just I found it really lifted my spirits, and there wasn't anybody around to make fun of me for it. So I think that there was a family group of Bigfoots because they have different fur colors from they're different individuals, the several that were seen around my house. And I think that they were noticing that here was this woman who day after day would be walking around singing, which is something most people don't do when they're walking around, and I'd be singing these German lieder songs and, whatever else there was. And so I think they made it their intention to kind of scope me out and see if they could, tell that I was okay, to let me know that they were there, perhaps. And I kind of kept up the habit, and I would sing around the outside of my house, and that often seemed to be when things happened. So, and then over time, I recognized a lot of things that were signs of their presence that until I really started reading the Bigfoot literature that's out there in depth, and there's a lot of good stuff to read, that I'd go, oh yeah, now I understand what that. And there's a lot more. There's more I haven't written down for publication. I may do that in my next book. I'm kind of waiting to see, but I've had quite a few different strange encounters with them.
I can't wait to read your next book, and I can't wait to hear more of your strange encounters. But we've kept you late, and amid of everybody's health scare at the moment, we should probably all get to bed, because I've heard that sleep is particularly helpful in fighting off this terrible virus.
Yes, yeah. And I'm just so grateful that you guys are there and you're okay, and my family is, and that it seems to be, that they're coming up with some possible, who knows, drug therapies that could shorten it. So I keep it positive, try and keep those thoughts positive as well.
And I hope that you and Nate and Steve and your entire family stay safe and healthy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And I also wanted to thank you again so much for just, the wonderful hosting and hostessing the two of you did at Midwest Weird Fest, which was just terrific. We were just so thrilled with the whole weekend. It was great.
Oh, you were just such a wonderful guest. And like I said, without you, there wouldn't be a Midwest Weird Fest. So it was literally our patron saint finally visiting. So thank you so much, Linda.
Oh, you're welcome. It was just a lovely time.
Oh, thank you.
That was a very intriguing conversation. Linda Godfrey has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all things cryptid and with the paranormal, and we truly look forward to her next endeavor. You can keep up with Linda's latest work at her official blog, lindagodfrey.com. There, you can also stream her award-winning documentary, Return to Wildcat Mountain, Wisconsin's Black Panther Nexus. Her most recent book, I Know What I Saw, Modern-Day Encounters with Monsters of New Urban Legend and Ancient Lore, is available from Amazon.com and most online and brick-and-mortar stores. You can also find us at TalkingWeird.com or on Facebook at Talking Weird Podcast. To make sure that you never miss an episode, you can subscribe to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms as well as YouTube. Next week, join us for another conversational journey into the paranormal realm. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.